The Russian and Ukrainian war has now lasted for more than 620 days. During this time period, hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions have been displaced, and economic shock waves have rippled across the world. In the last 12 months specifically, some of the bloodiest battles of the war have taken place, and the vast majority of the death toll occurred with minuscule changes in controlled territory for either side. Meanwhile, other regions of the world are heating up, and public attention of the West is slowly diverting elsewhere. So the question of the moment: when will it end? What terms will be met or imposed, and what will the world look like after? Let's dive into an analysis of the geopolitical situation and consider the motives of different players such as Ukraine, Russia, the US, and NATO. If you want more of this geopolitical content to appear on your screen, please like and subscribe and hit the bell icon so you get the next update. Thank you, and let's dive in. When considering the state of the war on this channel, we typically do not look at the usual factors that the mainstream media and some YouTube channels look at when measuring the outcome of the war. Casualties are generally a factor in achieving victory, but reliable numbers do not exist outside of the propaganda numbers published by the opposing ministries of defense. Not only that, but even considering the numbers each side is presenting are accurate, comparing these losses to past conflicts does not paint a situation that either side is scraping the barrel when it comes to human resources. Russia in World War II lost 20% of its population and still managed to win the war with a sweeping horde of soldiers that overwhelmed the German Wehrmacht. Ukraine, while a much smaller country, still had a pre-war population of 40 million people, removing females along with the old and the young, and along with those who have fled the country, and Ukraine likely has several million males that could possibly be turned into soldiers. Industrial production is a large factor, but since Russian production appears to at least be higher than pre-war levels, and Ukraine is being supplemented by military imports, this also cannot ultimately be used to determine the end of the war on its own. So these two factors will be considered in my analysis, but will not be the game-changing factors. My primary focus on determining the outcome of the war is political. There are two possibilities that I can see. First, the war will continue, in which case this video just could end here. Or second, a fragile peace will be achieved in the coming months. The second will be the main focus of the video. Two things have to happen for peace to be achieved. Both the US, including the NATO alliance, and Russia have to simultaneously be ready for peace negotiations. Whether or not Ukraine is ready to stop their efforts of fighting the Russians is frankly not one of them. Assuming Ukraine wants to keep up their attempts to recapture their land, they can only do so with support from NATO countries, chiefly the US. Ukraine does not have the tax revenue or economy to continue purchasing military equipment and paying soldiers without massive subsidies from the US and the European Union, where over half of their $44 billion military budget came from last year. So even if NATO allows their arms manufacturers to continue selling equipment to Ukraine, Ukraine cannot purchase it without financial assistance. U.S. President Joe Biden has stated that Ukraine will be the one who decides on peace, and NATO will support them until that moment comes. Unfortunately, this just isn't true, and it is also not entirely up to him. Politics and other military threats to NATO determine where the resources go. Whether or not the United States and the NATO alliance is ready to bring the war to an end is what matters, because they hold all the cards on the Ukrainian side. So first, we will discuss the US and NATO and what factors might push them in this direction. The US government openly speaks to the public about the modern-day challenges she faces. Rhetoric aside, Iran is an adversary of the United States and has the largest army in the Middle East. If the US takes their eye off the ball and war breaks out between Iran and Israel, or even Iran and Saudi Arabia, global oil supplies will quickly come offline. Not only that, but the Suez Canal, the fastest trade route between Asia and Europe, could easily go offline and sever the connections between one of the wealthiest markets in the world and the most populous and industrial region of the world. A large war in the Middle East could destroy the global economy and would have effects far beyond the inflation and fuel crisis caused by the Russo-Ukraine war. This is why the conflict in Israel has the attention of the United States, NATO, and President Joe Biden. When it comes to Ukraine, the US and NATO had an immediate interest in opposing Russia to keep the future safety of Europe. As many Ukrainian leaders have said, quote, Ukraine is the front line against Russia, so Poland and Romania don't have to be. Despite what the media would have you think, the reason for support for Ukraine is not based on sympathy, as many wars wage around the world without U.S. involvement, which certainly could use the sympathy. When the war in Ukraine began, there was a fear that if Ukraine rapidly fell in its entirety to Russia, then a confident and capable military, with the additional vast resources and population of Ukraine, could one day break the NATO alliance and invade Europe. Preventing the reincarnation of the Russian Empire at the time was logical. However, several months into the war in Ukraine, it was abundantly obvious that Russia did not currently have the military might to take over the entire country. So with the threat of a resurgent Russia, with Soviet borders gone, the U.S. reevaluated the situation and decided, since U.S. interests were intact in most places in the world, continuing the support for Ukraine was still the logical choice. After all, 2 successful counteroffensives had occurred, and since Russia is a traditional enemy of the United States, even more so now, if not during most of the post-Soviet period, then it would make sense to continue weakening them by supporting their enemies. Of course, I am ignoring public sentiment and the relationships forged between Ukraine and the U.S. over the last year. While the friendship no doubt plays a factor in America's decision to continue providing assistance, geopolitics is a game of 3D chess, moves and countermoves. Considering things like right and wrong, fair and unfair, or good versus evil play into people's emotions, which matters in a republic when it comes time for an election, but do little to assist one's victory in the great game outside of ensuring that the Democratic side continues playing. Israel would strongly argue that bombing and destroying Hamas terrorist cells in Gaza is paramount to their victory, while many others would strongly debate that the collateral damage among civilians is somewhere between morally wrong and outright evil, depending on who you ask. The same goes for the U.S. Republican administration under President George W. Bush, which carried out the war in Iraq, and the Democratic administration under President Barack Obama that oversaw a drone strike campaign across the Middle East that resulted in the deaths of thousands, terrorists and civilians alike. I am not suggesting that any particular party is good, bad, or justified in their actions. I am simply saying that, like in a game of chess, each player will attempt to use logic and their next move will always be made to benefit themselves. Now that there is potential for a wider war in the Middle East, the paradigm is altered. When it comes down to the choice of either weakening Russia or preventing the collapse of the global economy and preserving American and European business interests, the logical choice in terms of this great chess game is an easy one. Of course, there is the possibility that America tries to do both at once, but that opens up other possibilities. The CIA and military intelligence, which plays a large part in assisting the Ukrainian war effort, is now stretched between Ukraine and Israel and risks a slowed reaction of a potential confrontation between China and Taiwan. China, clearly the nearest peer military force to the U.S. on the planet, cannot be ignored. Taiwan, a close U.S. ally, is by far the most important to U.S. strategic interests. An eruption of war in the Middle East would freeze global trade, but would primarily hurt the European NATO countries who either buy their oil from the region or use it for shipping access. U.S. corporate interests would suffer, but the U.S. produces enough oil to satisfy its own needs and has much more capacity to increase output. The U.S. economy is also the most self-sufficient economy in the world, and 2 of its 3 largest trading partners are Canada and Mexico, which will be unaffected by global problems. China, the 3rd largest U.S. trading partner, primarily ships low-quality goods that are easy to manufacture. Strategic resources such as rare earth metals already exist in the U.S., but at present are simply not exploited. The vast majority of products shipped from China could easily be made in Mexico and at a much lower cost because of the cheaper price of labor. Factories and mines will need to be built, but after a brief period of pain, the U.S. will once again have what it needs. What it does not have, and what it cannot build in a short period of time, are the complex microchip fabrication facilities located in Taiwan. Allowing those to either fall into Chinese hands or be outright destroyed would cripple the U.S. economy for a decade or longer. So back to the decision board. When the United States has powerful but not endless military and espionage capabilities, but is faced with three choices: the degrading of Russian power, which is not a threat to invade our European allies, but is a traditional enemy; the stability of the Middle East, which could cause a collapse in global trade and an economic collapse of our European allies; or the protection of Taiwan, a critical stop in the technology supply chain that gives the U.S. its economic advantage to begin with. What remains to be seen is whether the U.S. will decide to tackle all three problems at once or focus resources on two of them to ensure greater success. If the United States commits to all three of them, then there is nothing left to discuss, and time will tell if the correct strategy was chosen. If the U.S. focus turns to the Middle East and Taiwan, then the U.S. will force Ukraine to begin peace negotiations with Russia. At that point, Russia's willingness to discuss peace will now be a factor. I do not know for sure if Russia will immediately begin peace negotiations, but based on some statistics available to the public, I believe that they might be. I am under the impression that the primary Russian goals were achieved in the first 2 months of the war, and if I am correct in that assumption, then peace talks will move forward. Reporting from Ukraine hints that neither side in the war has the capability to breach the other's lines, and a stalemate will continue. This chart shows the percentage change in total territory of Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians every month since the beginning of the war. As you can see, after Russia rapidly gained 17% of the country in February and March of 2022, and keep in mind the invasion began on the 24th of February, so only 5 days of fighting took place, their pace slowed to a halt shortly after. Battles like Popasna, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Bakhmut were Russian victories, but minuscule under the assumption that the Russian goal is to capture all of Ukraine. After a Russian withdrawal from the Ukrainian north, the UAF, which is the Ukrainian Armed Forces, by the way, launched a reconquest of the country that netted some gains, but has also crawled to a halt. In the year of 2023, in terms of square miles, territorial exchanges have been at most dead even. The Russian army's performance in the war has underwhelmed people's expectations. The incompetencies within the Russian command structure are apparent, and losses are far higher than reported. With all that being said, Russian resources are still vast, and I struggle to believe that an army capable of capturing 64,890 square miles of territory in 5 days and another 47,566 square miles a month later has completely forgotten how to conduct these types of operations a little over a year later. An argument can be made that not only the Ukrainian army is stronger, but the best Russian troops have been killed. I find this to be unlikely, as what makes a good soldier is combat experience, and with Russia perpetually in combat, there are plenty of good soldiers to form elite units. Ukraine has received equipment shipments from the West, but the idea Ukraine has more tanks and artillery than what they started the war with also seems unlikely, to say the least. Russia obviously has not attempted another large-scale breakthrough offensive like that of the first 2 months of the war. We know this from the mapping and the limited directions of attack. There are a few possible reasons I see for not doing so. First is a cost-profit analysis. Russia is not willing to pay another high price in human life for a large-scale attack. The next chunk of territory that has strategic value for Russia is the remainder of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. Reason being, the Dnieper would make a great defensible border for Russia. This territory is vast and does not have the same valuable resources or population as the Donbass, or the strategic positioning of the southern Zaporozhye Oblast. It is, however, perfect for the guerrilla warfare, and not only will a high price and equipment and manpower will be necessary to pay for it, but prices will continue to compound on the large occupation force that will be needed to hold it. The cost could be even higher than estimated if the West decides to draw a red line on the current borders and sends emergency shipments of advanced equipment to the Ukrainians. This means Russia cannot push forward but cannot be pushed back. Another reason is that Russia is more than content with what they have. The Zaporozhye region, along with the Azov Sea, is lightly populated, highly fertile farmland. Better yet, it serves as a territorial buffer between Ukraine and Russian interests in the Black Sea, but most importantly, it serves as a land bridge from Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, tasked with protecting Russia's warm water shipping ports. Russia has already completed a rail line that connects the two territories, relieving stress from the heavily targeted Crimean Bridge. The separatist Donbass republics are not only densely populated with ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking people, but also have vast mineral resources, infrastructure in place to exploit them, and the strongest industrial base inside of Ukraine. By capturing these territories, then entrenching themselves, Russia immediately secures its economic future for a day when the war is over and more countries are willing to trade with them. They also conserve their human and military resources, which are vast but also finite. I see these as the most likely explanations that we have not seen another major Russian offensive or larger conscription efforts to make such an offensive possible. Either way, in this case, Russia would be welcome to a pause in hostilities, just as reportedly they were open to it in March of 2022. I am doubtful that an actual peace treaty could be signed, as both parties are typically forced to give something and neither party has any reason to. Ukraine would have to revoke its claims from much of the current territory that Russia controls, which will not happen. Russia could have used the Kherson and Kharkiv territories as bargaining chips to give back to the Ukrainians, but that is no longer possible since they lost control of these territories in the fall. What can be achieved is a ceasefire, something that will benefit Russia in shoring up its defenses and routing out resistance movements, and will benefit both the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian economy. For the army, they can use the pause in the fighting to rest their troops, train new ones, and build up their equipment stocks that have been coming in at a much slower rate from the West. For Ukraine's economy, they can rebuild and repair infrastructure, return many of their refugees from abroad to supplement their workforce, and restart exports from their Black Sea ports of Mykolaiv and Odessa. Ukraine will be hurt politically and emotionally by a ceasefire. The current government, which promised the return of territories in exchange for lives, will have failed and will be ousted in the next election. The average Ukrainian will be traumatized not only by the loss of their loved ones, but the looming shadow of national defeat. This does, however, preserve a path for the future of Ukraine. Western assistance for rebuilding the economy and retraining the army could greatly supplement Ukraine's resurgence. Ukraine does face a problem with birth rates, exacerbated by the death of thousands of young men, but war throughout history often induces population booms once a ceasefire has been achieved. Young soldiers returning to their lovers' arms led to the creation of the baby boomers, the world's most populous generation, and led to massive population increases in Germany, France, Russia, and the United States after World War II. Traumatized cultures also possess motivations that cannot be learned in their absence. Motive to become highly educated in East Germany and South Korea was widespread and far surpassed that of their communist counterparts. Considering the model of South Korea, the western territories of Ukraine could become highly prosperous and technologically advanced with the assistance of the US and Europe. More importantly, the achievement of a semi-permanent ceasefire rather than a peace deal retains Ukrainian claims on their former territories. This is important in the case that Russia does eventually collapse, as many have predicted. Decades from now, Ukraine could be in a position to recapture all of her lost territory and be much more well off than before the beginning of the conflict in 2022. This is also the primary reason Russia would not be open to negotiations. As stated at the beginning of the war, part of the Russian demands from Ukraine was that Ukraine would reduce its military spending and would add a clause to their constitution forbidding them from joining NATO. While Ukraine likely cannot join NATO, even in the case of a fragile ceasefire, separate military agreements could be made with individual members who could continue to finance their military. Russia would be unhappy with this, and in many press conferences has stated that such a situation would be unacceptable. As far as the record is concerned, not meeting any of Russia's demands is unacceptable. I believe people put too much weight on the words spoken by politicians. For a ceasefire to take place, both sides will have to give something up. For the Russians, they will likely have to give up on the idea that Ukraine dismantles its military and renders itself defenseless, all on the promise that Russia will not invade again, without any third party being allowed to intervene if they do. So, in the next several months, an opportunity exists to end the fighting. Ukrainians and Russians will stop dying, refugees could return home, and the United States could focus on bigger problems, and Ukraine could start to rebuild. Alternatively, the fighting could continue, and we will flip a coin to see if the world dives further into chaos before the next opportunity for peace arises. Let me know if you think there is a chance for peace in the comments. For now, that is all from me. Until next time.